Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one we start out in the direction west of Donetsk, where we see the Russians have fully captured Semenivka here to the northwest of Avdiivka. The Russians have also advanced in the northern outskirts of Berdishi, securing the northern flank of the village. This leaves only the western parts under Ukrainian control. This means the Russians have made significant progress here in the direction of Berdishi and Semenivka. With full control over Semenivka, the Russians have now connected their positions between Berdishi and the village of Semenivka, which will allow the Russians to gather in the central points and push in a northwestern direction. It's likely that the Russians will capture the rest of Berdishi in the next few days before connecting with the fortifications, capturing those as well here in the southern positions of Novobakhmutivka and Soloviove before they securely connect these locations through the main supply route, allowing them to then connect all of these positions to launch further offensive operations in the direction of Novoselivka, Persha, Novopokrovsk, and Sokil in the north. Further north, in the direction of Ozheretine, the Russians have now captured the village of Soloviove, here to the south of the village. The Russians have also expanded their zone of control here to the west of Ozheretine and to the northeast of the village. In all of those areas, the Russians are continuing their offensive operation to take advantage of the capture of Ozheretine and the high ground associated with it to push throughout the front towards the Ukrainian positions to take advantage of the Ukrainian disarray. The Ukrainian disarray I'm referring to is this article by Forbes. A Ukrainian brigade disappeared and a Russian brigade almost broke through. How the battle for Ocheretine upended the war in Ukraine this weekend. In this article, the author writes that instead of the 47th Brigade, which was already completely exhausted from the battles elsewhere across the front that they have undergone ever since the Ukrainian summer offensive, it was instead the 115th Mechanized Brigade, which was supposed to take over the defense of the village. However, the unit simply left the village of Osheretine down south to Novobakhmutivka, west to Soloviove, and all of these villages have now been captured by the Russians. The 47th Mechanized Brigade was sent back to the front to plug the gap after the 115th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces left their positions. This is why the Russians managed to gain a significant foothold in the south, following which the Ukrainians launched a counterattack, regaining positions in the outskirts of the village and hitting the Russian positions within the village. But following the 47th Mechanized Brigade returning to the village and regaining positions there, the Russians continuously bombarded those positions and stormed them, capturing the outskirts of the village and gaining full control over Ocheretine, which with today has full control of 100% control of Ocheretine and the surrounding fortifications. There's simply one fortification outside of Ocheretine to the east that the Russians will now be fighting over, but other than that, the Russians have full control of Ocheretine. Following that, the Russians started offensive operations in the direction of Khahanske, here in the northeastern direction, to capture that village, flanking the Ukrainian positions by Keramik and Novokalinove. This means that the Russians would be able to launch offensive operations to capture the northeastern section of the front line, pushing further northeast to the Kalinove village, would allow the Russians to have a significant flank here in the northern direction. At the same time, the Russians will be launching offensive operations northwest and southwest of Osheretine to expand their control further northwestern direction. We see that the following battles taking place here northwest of Avdiivka are centered around the northern flank. The southern flank have been fairly silent. This is likely an operational pause as they work on taking advantage of Operation Breakthrough in the northwestern part of Avdiivka through Osheretine. It's likely that the fighting by Osheretine will continue until the Russians lose momentum, after which the Russian Air Force and drone force will start focusing on the southern flank, where the target would be Umanska, Yesvoprodivka, and Udnetailove. There would be no significant breakthrough following the capture of these three villages by the Russians, but it will secure the southern flank to allow the Russians to focus on the western parts of Avdiivka here in the northern direction. At the same time, with the fighting over Krasnoarivka, reaching a critical stage with the fighting reaching the central part of the city. The Russians will look to gain control over the southern road as well to create a strong buffer zone between the city of Donetsk and the Ukrainian positions. It is likely that the Russians, at the very least, are looking for something like this, where they have a large buffer zone between their positions and the Ukrainian positions by the front line. This will likely also continue down south. With the capture of Novo-Mikhailivka, the Russians will start fighting by Peroskovivka and Konstantinivka to gain control over this road west of Konstantinivka all the way down south to Volodar to create a buffer zone there as well. Based on this, it is likely that the Russians will focus on several areas, one of which is Kudahove, which is a heavily fortified village by the Ukrainians that was recently fortified over the past year, and it has a well established connection between the village itself and Pokrovsk, with this railway going directly between the village and the city, going through Selidove. Selidove itself here is a village which has been a center for a lot of training exercises. With its close proximity to the front line, it's so far away it's difficult to hit it, which means that the Ukrainians on rotation usually pass through it. This means that the Russian targets following the battles of Ocheretine, Netailove, and Krasnoorivka, all the way down to Volodar, would be focused around the villages of Kurahove and Selidove here to the west of Donetsk before the Battle of Pokrovsk starts. The Ukrainians are currently facing difficulties defending their positions with this rapid advance by the Russians. Just in the period of 25th of April, the Russians have made significant advances across the front, both in Krasnoorivka and by Ocheretine, where the Russians managed to capture Semenivka, Soloviove, and secure Ocheretine in the north, advance within Berdishi, and expand their zone of control, while at the same time storming the central parts and the fortifications in the center of Krasnoorivka, as well as the industrial zone of the city. All of this in one day marks a significant change in the front line. This one article by the Associated Press talks about one of the reasons that is the case. Ukraine pulls US provided Abrams tanks from the front lines over Russian drone threats. It pretty much says that the Ukrainians are not willing to lose their Abrams tanks due to the Russian drones completely preventing them from operating, as the Ukrainians, if they do choose to operate these Abrams tanks, they would just be destroyed by the drones. So the Ukrainians are refusing to operate them in these operations to defend, as the tanks are mainly used for offensive operations, for operational breakthroughs, and such. At the same time, the Ukrainians are promising another offensive operation in the next months. This means that the Ukrainians want to save up on their armored vehicles. And at the same time, there is this article by Politico: US preparing to announce $6 billion in weapons contracts for Ukraine. The package could be finalized and announced as soon as Friday and will include Patriot systems. This so far sounds and looks amazing for Ukraine until you read the small print at the bottom of the page. The equipment would likely won't arrive in Ukraine for several years, as the money is being allocated under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. Pretty much what this means is that the United States is not sending Ukraine something from its own stock. It is instead sending an order with the company producing the Patriot systems. And once that order is finished, they will actually receive the Patriot system. This can take years because there's already a production line, there's a priority line. Other countries have ordered Patriot systems, and the US industrial capacity is not sufficient to produce enough quickly enough. This means it could take years for this Patriot system to finish production and arrive at Ukraine. So this is two huge issues for Ukraine. Besides the Ukrainian brigades simply disappearing, this is the second time a Ukrainian brigade left the front. The first was the 67th Brigade in the direction of Chesev Yar. This means in just a few more days and weeks, the Ukrainians had two brigades that simply refused to fight and allowed the Russians to break through due to the lack of ammunition and the whole bombardment of their positions. This means that as the fighting intensifies, the Ukrainian brigades would be less willing to fight due to low morale, lack of both equipment, materials, and ammunition. This all adds up to the Russians' advances and advantages increasing significantly, while the United States aid package is only a drop in the bucket as it has pretty much no effect on the front because all of the aid package is pretty much just the US restocking what it has already sent to Ukraine and orders that are going to be delivered in multiple years. At the very least, the ammunition is expected to be delivered within the next 12 months. So that is something that the Ukrainians may be able to survive until they see. In the direction of Krynky, the Ukrainians, as smart as they are in the general staff, decided to establish their positions in Krynky, start offensive operations there, and intensify them as well to capture these positions within the village and start another meat grinder, as the Ukrainians so far has lost hundreds, if not thousands, of Marines trying to establish a bridgehead across the Dnieper River and have failed so far, while the Russians simply look on as they use this opportunity to launch counter battery strikes on Ukrainian artillery across the Dnieper River in the Kherson region, and at the same time hit the Ukrainian Marines taking up positions within the village with their own artillery and drones to inflict casualties on the Ukrainian positions. This is purely a PR stunt. There's no possibility, realistically, that the Ukrainians actually establish positions here across the Dnieper River and establish a proper foothold and supply a route across the Dnieper River towards these positions to start offensive operations in this direction. It is purely a PR stunt in an attempt to divert from the situation across the front, where the Ukrainian forces are significantly hit and are in a very detrimental situation. Instead of spending these soldiers and equipment in an area that is actually needed, they simply use them and waste them in an attempt to gain a foothold that is practically impossible to gain. And that'll be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.